Okay, I shall start. The weight of God, consciousness in science fiction and myth. Science fiction, like myth, is grounded in the dominant ideology or belief system of its time. Myth, in the words of Jakob Burckhardt, was, quote, the underlying given factor in Greek existence. The dominance of myth, he maintained, quote, must have been much reinforced by the polis as the pattern of national life and by the bards. In our day, science enjoys a similar predominance. One needs only note how governments across the world have responded to the current outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic in justifying their policies by insisting that they were following the advice of, quote, the scientists. They did this because science has come to exercise a powerful hold on the popular imagination, demanding from the public faith in matters that are not always fully understood. Contemporary science has, in effect, usurped what was once the role of myth or religion, replacing it as a repository of truth, to become the master narrative of our civilization. Yet, it's worth pointing out that science is in many ways indebted to imagery and ideas that were first established through mythology. The very names given to planets and star clusters or to the days of the week are testament to this. The bards whom Burckhardt mentions, however, have been superseded by prose writers and film directors in dealing with science fiction. To append the word fiction to science is to acknowledge explicitly that what is being narrated is made up, even if it depends upon fabrications that derive plausibility from the prevailing belief system, as myth did in ancient Greece. The bards of ancient Greece regaled the assembled company with tales over which the gods presided. The authors of science fiction offer the readers of late modernity accounts at the core of which contemporary scientific discoveries are accommodated. Gods and ideas, respectively, are the focal points of the ancient and the modern. Abstract, invisible, and yet to their audiences credible. To express the difference aphoristically, one may say that mythology celebrates gods of ideas, weather, agriculture, war, love, death, whereas science fiction entertains ideas of gods. The balance of power has shifted from divine providence to human intelligence, where once gods were masters of a universe in which they were able to overcome human rivals. The ingenuity of the human mind has now become paramount. Just a couple of quotations, to distinguish the difference or the transition from myth to science. Gottfried Richter, writing as an art historian, has written, science increasingly forgets how to look for God. Religion loses its connection with the world. Awareness that gradually arises out of science. Sorry, read that again. Loses its connection with the world's awareness that gradually arises out of science. Art begins to forget that too. It has a part in the revelation of the mysteries of the world. The great universal secularization begins. And from a completely different angle, Gary Zucker, writing on quantum physics, quantum mechanics, writes, the advent of science marks the beginning of the ascent of left hemispheric thinking into the dominant mode of Western cognition, and the descent of right hemispheric thinking into the underground status, from which it did not emerge with scientific recognition until Freud's discovery of the unconscious. So to sum up then, the gods have disappeared, not only from the face of the earth, but even from their heavenly abode. Space age exploration is responsible. In fiction, if not in fact, it's dispossessed the old mythological gods. What was once venerated as sacred space has become the province of outer space, or sometimes its inverse, inner space. And following the demise of the former deities, a task presented itself to authors of science fiction, namely to reinvent them. And one is tempted to add the biblical phrase, in their own image and likeness. So in this presentation, I want to consider two novels in support of this assertion. Frank Herbert's Destination Void and Richard Powers' Galatia 2.2. Each, in its own way, interrogates the nature of human consciousness and its ability to reproduce itself cybernetically. In a sense, they've adapted the Delphic maxim, know thyself, and turned it into a scientific question for the contemporary world. Can a machine know itself? The acquisition of self-knowledge has two central pillars, intelligence and awareness, and these are qualities essential to consciousness. Well, I start with the later novel, Galatia 2.2. That's the front cover, and you can see the source of that. Clearly, the myth of Galatia is invoked here. Its very title, Galatia 2.2, is indicative of a link between artificial intelligence in the novel and mythology. As I'm sure you know, the Ovidian version of the myth of Galatia had to do with the creation and the animation granted by Aphrodite of a female statue with whom the artist Pygmalion became infatuated. The challenge at the core of Powers' novel is to construct an electronic device that is equivalent in intelligence to that of a master's student in world literature. The test of this is the ability of the machine to complete an end-of-year examination at the appropriate level. Although the novel's title alludes directly to the myth, the name Galatia never appears in the narrative. Instead, the narrator, who is also called Richard Powers and a novelist, works with a scientist on a program that goes through a series of iterations from A to H before eventually becoming known in the last of its iterations as Helen. Parallel to this plot is the narrator's account of his infatuation with a female postgraduate student, referred to throughout the novel, not by name, but ironically by a letter, the letter A. And as a counterpoint to his current crush, Powers reminisces repeatedly and often painfully about an earlier attraction towards another female student, known only as C. Some of the strands of the novel fall outside the genre of science fiction, but they're cleverly intertwined with the cybernetic plot. The title itself of the novel, Galatia 2.2, is ambiguous. It could refer either to the construction of Helen or to the fantasies of A and C that the narrator recreates in his imagination. The central theme of the book, which unites the various strands, is an exploration of consciousness, in which the science fiction element is very much to the fore, as we learn of Helen's metamorphosis from machine architecture to sentient being, capable of feeling emotions. This, in its turn, leads eventually to a consideration of mythology, as the narrator decides that it was time to try Helen on the religious mystery, the mystery of cognition. Quote from the novel: "Should have no end of myths of immortals coming down and taking human bodies, dying human deaths. Helen knew how to interpret that scripture. If gods could do this human thing, then we could as well. That plot was the mind's brainchild, awareness explaining itself to itself." The epigraph of the novel is a poem by Emily Dickinson on the theme of consciousness. The third and final stanza of that poem reads, "The brain is just the weight of God, for heft them pound for pound, and they will differ, if they do, a syllable from sound." The last line of this poem is taken up again towards the end of the novel, as the narrator reflects upon the rest mass of God. To tie the scientific formulation of mass, which may be expressed as the object's weight divided by the acceleration of gravity, to the transcendental idea of God, which itself is weightless and therefore free of gravity, is to offer an epitome of the novel's preoccupation with what is referred to in the same paragraph as the immaterial in mortal garb. Syllable and sound, similarly, are the weightless freight of language in which consciousness is made manifest. I'll move to the second work now, Destination Void, by Frank Herbert. Consciousness is also the central focus of this novel. The action takes place on a spaceship, the Earthling, ostensibly on a journey to Tau Ceti, which is expected to take 200 years to complete. 4 humanoid operators make up the crew assigned to steer the vessel's cargo of 3,000 individuals in a state of hibernation to its colonial destination. The complexity of the enterprise is beyond the wit of the crew, who are dependent upon the organic mental core, or OMC, a supercomputer developed from a human brain. All well and good, except that at the point the novel begins, the OMC, the autonomous consciousness, has stopped functioning as intended, and Bickle, the computer technician, has severed its connections. On the first page of the novel, we read, "There had been no doubt about what had to be done. The OMC had gone mad, a wild runaway consciousness. It had been a sick ball of grey matter whose muscles turned every servo on the ship into a murder weapon, who stared out at them with madness from every sensor, who raged gibberish at them from every vocoder." The vocoder is the OMC's sound system, which at the height of its malfunction utters meaningless sounds and symbols that the crew are unable to interpret, an indication of, at this stage in the novel, of its scrambled consciousness. The title of the novel is enigmatic. Does machine failure mean that the journey will be aborted, voided? Or, as the narrative goes on to suggest, was it known all along by control command on moon base that the spaceship had no destination? The novel consists mainly of the conversations and thoughts of the crew members as they tackle the crisis of the defunct operating system. And the main topic of conversation is the nature of autonomous consciousness. The novel sustains a pseudo-scientific jargon throughout, one which is often impenetrable and, given the current stage of information technology, out of date. I think I better speed up a bit, so I'll leave that bit out. Well, eventually, Bickle succeeds in rebooting the operating system, but only at the cost of linking the brains of the crew to the central computer. The knowledge that the OMC acquires in the process includes an awareness of a death wish that lies deep in their unconscious. It's at this point, then, that the mythological perspective is invoked, when Bickle says, there were Greeks who said that even the gods must die. As the narrative makes clear, it's necessary for the OMC to incorporate this awareness of death, the ultimate self-knowledge, in order for it to come back to life. As the novel states, death was the background against which life could know itself. A similar observation about awareness explaining itself to itself, a formulation that could be said to offer a definition of consciousness, is made in Galatia 2.2, when Helen had no end of myths about immortals. Soon after it achieves this level of awareness and intelligence, the spaceship reaches Tau Ceti, although the crew fail to understand how they arrived at their destination so soon. The OMC, however, assures them that it's not important that they know, for it understands. It tells them through the vocoder, my understanding transcends all possibilities of this universe. I do not need to know this universe because I possess this universe as a direct experience. This statement confirms the machine's acquisition of consciousness, and indeed the deification of the organic mental core, which is ratified in the last chilling words of the novel that provide a fitting climax to the space odyssey of the Earthling. Let me conclude then by saying that the two novels discussed in this paper belong to a subgenre of science fiction that deals with cosmic consciousness, the weight of God. If consciousness is an elusive concept, then so too is God. The inscription in the temple of Apollo at Delphi, the northeast of Thon, know thyself, served as a beacon for the whole of ancient Greece, as much for the followers of Logos as for the adherents of mythos. Through time, this injunction has never been entirely forgotten. It has, as is the nature of myth, experienced many metamorphoses, and in our technological age, it resurfaces in the quintessentially postmodern genre of science fiction that combines mythos and logos. Just as in the Ovidian story of Galatia that tells of the coming to life of an ivory statue, the contemporary genre delights in the interplay of the living and the lifeless in its exploration of the enigma of consciousness. Consciousness which has at its core intelligence and awareness, expressed as Emily Dickinson clearly and vividly understood in language. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Burnett. As always, your talks are extremely inspiring. I don't need to remember that we have taken from you the several notions. For instance, that one of the valence, mythical valence, you have spoken in previous times. Thank you very much. This time you have spoken about this objectivity of our subjectivity, if I can say, about awareness in an objective way. Thank you very much. And now let's see if there are any questions. I don't know if you can. Oh, thank you very much. Can you see, Leon, the questions? Now is by Christina Doko. Can you read, or do you need I read them?
Yeah, I can read it, yeah.
Okay.
As usual, Christina, your questions are very probing. I think I should point out that the novelist is Richard Powers. The character in the novel is Richard Powers. So we have a situation perhaps a bit like James Joyce in Portrait of the Artist as a young man, about we don't know quite how much the author is drawing from his own life or creating a fiction of it. So I think I would certainly endorse what you're saying about the author as a God creator. I mean, there's clearly an awareness on Richard Powers' part that his novel is creating the artificial intelligence of Helen. But Helen is the one who is given the knowledge that is equivalent to the OMC in Destination Void, total knowledge, because she's fed virtually all the information you find in the Library of Congress. So my closing point was about intelligence and awareness being expressed in language. Of course, that's not the only form of consciousness. We can have non-verbal consciousness, but the very fact that Powers has chosen to use the epigraph, the weight of God, referring to the weight of God, I think is indicative of the author as being equal, you know, the brain being equal to the weight of God, the author as being equal to God in terms of creation. And just to finish, my point was that human intelligence in a lot of science fiction has superseded or perhaps even overturned the idea of divine providence.
Okay, thank you. There is another question, this time by Metka Zupanchik. Although not considered a direct inspiration for Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, do you see any influence of Herbert's novel on the movie?
I actually cut out a reference to 2001: A Space Odyssey because of time. I think they're very similar in the thematics. Whether there's an influence, I'm not sure. Of course, Kubrick took the plot of 2001: Space Odyssey from Arthur C. Clarke. And Arthur C. Clarke has written a book on that interaction between the two of them. And as far as I remember, Clarke doesn't mention Herbert, but clearly, I mean, he would have known about Homer's writing. So I don't see it as a strong influence.